first thing they tell you at orientation isn't about bears. It isn't about flash floods or hypothermia, or what to do when a tourist snaps an ankle 4 miles from the nearest access road. All of that comes later, packaged in laminated binders with the Park Service seal embossed on the cover. The first thing they tell you, the very first thing before you've even been fitted for your uniform, before you've signed the second page of your employment contract, is where you don't go. It's not a long conversation. Ranger Delwood Briggs gave it to me in under 40 seconds. He walked me to the eastern wall of the ranger station, where a topographic map of the entire park hung behind a sheet of scratched plexiglass, sun-faded at the corners. The elevation line so familiar to the staff that nobody looked at it anymore. He put his index finger on a shaded area in the upper northeast quadrant, roughly 3 square miles of mixed conifer and granite shelf terrain sitting above the 7,400-foot elevation line. No trails marked through it, no visitor designation, no color coding that matched anything in the map legend printed along the bottom edge. That's Zone 9, he said. We don't patrol it, we don't survey it. If a visitor claims they came from that direction, you document it and you call it in to administration directly. You don't go looking for where they came from. I waited for the rest. There wasn't a rest. What's in there? I asked. Briggs pulled his finger off the map and looked at me the way you'd look at someone who'd just asked why you don't touch a hot burner. Not annoyed, not secretive, just finished with the subject. The way you're finished with something that was never really open for discussion. Nothing, he said. That's the point. I was 26 years old. I'd completed 18 months of seasonal work at 2 other parks, and I'd earned this position through 3 rounds of applications. I thought I understood institutional subtext. I filed it under sensitive ecological designation, breeding corridor, fragile substrate, something requiring passive protection rather than active management. And I moved on. Parks have protected zones. It's not unusual. You learn to route around them the same way you learn to route around private inholdings and research plots. You don't ask for a justification every time a boundary exists. That was 12 years ago. I want to be precise about something before I go further. I'm not writing this because something happened last week. I'm not writing this from a place of acute fear or fresh shock. I'm writing this because I finally allowed myself to add things up, deliberately, methodically, the way I was trained to document. And the sum is something I cannot look away from anymore. 12 years is a long time to not notice a pattern. It is also a long time for a pattern to grow large enough that noticing it becomes unavoidable. What I'm going to tell you is what I actually observed, not what I imagined, not what I felt in the dark at 3 a.m. What I watched happen in daylight, with my own trained eyes, documented in a personal notebook I've kept since year 8. The park covers just under 280,000 acres in the northern Cascades. Granite peaks, old-growth Douglas fir, high alpine meadow above the tree line, creek drainages that run cold and clear through June and slow to a trickle by late August. On any given day during peak season, we carry 6 to 8 rangers on active patrol, 2 on visitor services, 1 rotating through administrative duty at the station. We know each other's routes. After enough years in a place, you can predict where any given colleague will be at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, just from the season and the weather. The park becomes a kind of clock, and the rangers are its hands. Zone 9 sits in the northeast corner like a stopped gear. There are no maintained trails within a half mile of its boundary. That's not by itself unusual. Backcountry terrain goes untrailed all the time, especially above 7,000 feet, where the rock makes construction impractical and visitor traffic thins to almost nothing. What's unusual is the approach pattern to that boundary. Every patrol route in the northeast sector curves, not dramatically, not in a way you'd ever catch if you were just reading a map, but when you've walked those routes for 12 years, when you know the terrain the way you know the layout of your own house at midnight without the lights on, you feel the curve. The routes bend west earlier than the topography requires. There's no ridge forcing the turn, no drainage making the direct line impassable. The trail just angles away, and you follow it, and you've been trained so thoroughly to follow it that the turn feels like your own idea. I noticed this first at year 4. I remember the exact moment because I was training a seasonal hire named Petra Vance, running her through the northeast loop for the first time, and she stopped at the bend near the granite outcropping above Coldwater Creek and looked upslope with her hand shading her eyes. "Why don't we cut straight through?" she said. "The grade's better. It's flatter up that way." And I said, without pausing, without thinking, "We just don't go that way on this route." I heard Briggs in my own mouth, his exact cadence. The same flat closure, the same absence of explanation offered as if it were explanation enough. I felt something flicker at the back of my mind, a small recognition that didn't quite surface. And then I redirected Petra's attention to the creek drainage below and kept walking. I didn't think about it again in any sustained way for another 3 years. That's the thing about a well-installed habit. It doesn't feel like a habit, it feels like preference. Year 6, a hiker came out of the northeast sector on a Tuesday in late July. Mid-40s, male, solo trip, came down through the boulder field above the Coldwater trailhead. He was tired in the ordinary way, sunburned across the nose, low on water, a hot spot developing on his left heel. Nothing alarming. I documented his exit point, reminded him about trail boundaries and permit requirements for overnight backcountry stays, and asked him the standard questions. When I asked where he'd entered, he pointed northeast and gave me a rough description of a creek crossing and a ridge line that placed him somewhere in the outer edge of Zone 9's boundary. I wrote it down. Then I called the administration number. The same woman answered who always answered. I hadn't counted how many times I'd called her yet. That accounting came later, but her voice was already familiar, measured, unhurried. She asked me the 4 questions in the same order she always asked them. How many people? Which direction they exited? Physical condition? And then the last one. Did they mention seeing anything? I told her no, and she thanked me and the line went quiet. I hung up and went back to my shift report and wrote the exit as a standard off-trail incursion. That was the protocol. That was what the protocol had always been. Here's what I didn't ask myself until year 8. Seeing anything is not a standard question. We don't ask it about any other sector. When a visitor comes out of the backcountry in the western drainage or the southern ridge trail or any of the other 11 patrol zones, the documentation is geographic and medical. Location, condition, permit status. That's the complete list. There is no analog question for any zone except this one. I had been hearing, did they mention seeing anything as boilerplate for 7 years without registering that it had no equivalent anywhere else in the protocol? The question assumes there is something to see. It has always assumed that. Year 8 is when I started the notebook. Black cover, college ruled, The same brand I'd used for field notes since my first seasonal posting. I bought it at the hardware store in town and kept it in my personal truck, not the park vehicle. I want to be honest about why I made that choice. I wasn't protecting myself from anything specific yet. I just understood instinctively that whatever I was starting to look at, I didn't want it in official documentation. I went back through 7 years of memory and wrote down every Zone 9 adjacent observation I could reconstruct with confidence. Then I began recording new ones in real time. The first pattern the notebook revealed was clustering. Visitor exits from the northeast sector didn't distribute randomly across the season. They came in groups. 3 or 4 people emerging within the same 10 to 14 day window, then nothing for 4 or 5 months, then another cluster. I cross-referenced this against weather records going back 5 years. No correlation with storm systems, with snowmelt timing, with peak visitation periods. The clusters followed their own calendar, and I didn't know what that calendar was keyed to. The second pattern took longer to see because it was a pattern of absence. I began mentioning Zone 9 casually in conversation with colleagues, not raising it as a topic, not asking direct questions, just letting the name surface naturally. Northeast corner's running dry this summer. That granite shelf above Zone 9 must be brutal in this heat. 6 rangers over 8 months. Every single time the conversation moved within 2 exchanges. Not rudely, not in any way that would register as deflection if you weren't specifically watching for it. A natural topic shift, smooth and unhurried. Like water finding the path of least resistance. You'd never notice it unless you were keeping count. I was keeping count. 6 for 6. The third thing I recorded was the gate. There's a Forest Service access road that runs along Zone 9's western boundary. Unpaved, rutted, technically within park jurisdiction but rarely used for anything beyond equipment access. Mile marker, 14 has a turnoff with a standard green metal gate. I'd driven past it dozens of times. In year 8, I stopped and looked at it properly. For the first time, the gate was padlocked. That was normal. What was not normal was the lock itself. Bright, unweathered steel, no surface rust, no UV yellowing on the shackle. In a gate, accessing terrain that the entire institution agreed was never entered on a road that no patrol route required. Someone had recently enough that the hardware still looked store-bought, replaced the lock. I sat in the truck and looked at it until the lights started to shift. Then I drove back to the station, filed my end-of-shift report. Didn't mention the gate, didn't mention the lock. Another old habit expressing itself without my permission. 12 years of not looking has a momentum to it. You think you've decided to pay attention, and then you find yourself performing the old silence anyway, and you can't quite locate the moment you chose to do it. That's the most unsettling thing I can tell you about the early years. Not that something was being hidden, but that I had learned to hide it from myself so completely, so automatically, that I genuinely could not feel the seam. The notebook got heavier in year 9. Not physically. Same cheap black cover, same college-ruled pages. But the weight of what I was writing in it changed the way I carried it. I started leaving it locked in the glove box of my personal truck instead of the center console. Small adjustment, the kind of adjustment you make before you've consciously decided you need to make it. I want to tell you about Ranger Corinne Halsey because she matters to what comes next. And because she's the reason I know I wasn't constructing something out of nothing. Corinne had been at the park for 9 years when I met her at year 1 of my posting. She knew the terrain better than anyone on staff, better than Briggs in some ways. because she'd done her first 2 years almost exclusively on backcountry patrol before trail maintenance absorbed most of her schedule. She was methodical and unhurried, and she had the specific kind of competence that never needs to announce itself. I trusted her judgment more than anyone else on the team. Over 12 years, she became the closest thing I had to a real colleague, rather than just a coworker. In early spring of year 9, I asked her directly about Zone 9, not a casual mention designed to watch for deflection. A direct question sitting across from her at the break room table with coffee going cold between us and nobody else in the station. "Corinne," I said, "what do you actually know about the Northeast Zone?" She looked at me for a moment, not the way Briggs had looked at me, not closed and finished, something more considered, like she was measuring something before she responded. "Why are you asking?" she said. "Because I've been here 12 years and I've never heard anyone explain it." She picked up her coffee, took a slow sip she didn't need, put it back down and looked at the table between us. "When I was in my second year," she said, "I went up to the boundary, not past it, just to the edge, up near the ridge line above the creek. I was running a vegetation survey, and I got close enough to see into the tree line on the other side." She stopped. I waited. "What did you see?" I asked. "Nothing," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. That's what's wrong with it. I could see maybe 40 yards into the tree line from the ridge. Clear sight lines, good light, midday in July. And there was just nothing. No bird movement, no squirrel activity, no wind signature in the canopy, even though I could feel the wind at my back. The trees were moving on my side of the boundary and completely still on the other side." She paused. "I wrote it up as a microclimate observation and filed it with administration." "And?" "Briggs told me the survey didn't cover that sector, and to resubmit with the correct zone designation, so I resubmitted it under Zone 8, which it wasn't. That was the end of it." She picked up her coffee again, and this time she actually drank it. "I haven't been back to that ridge line," she said. "I could tell you it's because my patrol routes don't take me there. That's even technically true." She looked at me steadily. "Don't go up to the boundary, Marcus." She used my first name. In 9 years of working together, I could count on one hand the number of times she'd used my first name in a professional context. It was a register shift, deliberate and quiet, and it landed exactly as she intended it to. I told her I wouldn't. I drove home that evening and added the conversation to the notebook, word for word, as close as I could reconstruct it. Then I sat in my driveway for a while with the engine off. 2 things lived in what she told me. The first was the dead air in the canopy. No bird movement, no animal activity, no wind signature crossing an invisible line. That's not a microclimate. Microclimates affect temperature and humidity. They don't selectively stop fauna and wind movement at a discrete boundary. Whatever she'd seen, it wasn't a weather phenomenon, and she knew it. She'd filed it that way because that was the only available category. The second thing was simpler and worse. Corinne Halsey, 9 years of backcountry experience, the most capable ranger on the team, had seen something she couldn't explain at the edge of Zone 9. And her response, the response of a methodical and rational professional, was to never go back. I trusted her judgment. That's the problem. I trusted her judgment completely. Spring of year 9 also gave me the first visitor I paid full attention to. Her name was Diane Ferris. 51 years old, experienced hiker, day pack, proper boots. She She came out of the northeast sector on a Thursday morning and flagged me down on the Coldwater Access Road. She was physically fine. No injuries, good hydration, calm. The calm was what I noticed. Most off-trail visitors come out slightly sheepish or defensive about the permit situation, or animated with the energy of having done something inadvertent and survived it. She was none of those things. She was quiet in a way that felt less like composure and more like something had been turned down. I ran through the documentation questions. When I got to her entry point, she described a trail junction at a dry creek bed that I recognized as sitting well inside Zone 9's western boundary. She'd gone in on the previous afternoon and spent the night. I kept my voice neutral. What made you choose that area? I didn't, really, she said. I was following a route I'd done before, and the junction looked different than I remembered. I thought I knew where I was. She looked past me toward the northeast tree line. I made camp when the light went. The night was fine. I slept well. I woke up and walked out. Did anything unusual happen while you were in there? She brought her eyes back to me. No, she said. Then, after a pause that was one beat too long, it was very quiet. It was very quiet. I wrote it down exactly like that. Not peaceful, not still, quiet, the way Corinne had described stillness in the canopy, an absence of sound as a condition rather than a quality. I called administration from the station after she left. The woman answered. Asked her 4 questions. When she got to the last one, did she mention seeing anything? I said no. She didn't mention seeing anything. Then I added, she mentioned it was very quiet. A pause on the line. Short, maybe 2 seconds. In 9 years of making this call, I had never heard a pause before the sign-off. Thank you, the woman said. Document it in the standard format. She hung up before I could respond. I stood with the phone in my hand and understood fully for the first time that the woman on the other end of that line had been waiting for a different answer, not hoping nothing had happened, waiting to hear what had. There were 2 more visitor exits from the northeast sector that season, both within the same 10-day window as Diane Ferris. Cluster behavior. Consistent with everything in the notebook, I documented both. Called administration both times. Both visitors described the quiet. One of them, a man in his mid-30s, who gave his name as Paul Garrett, added something that the others hadn't. The trees on the way out looked different, he said. I asked him what he meant. They looked older, he said. I don't mean a different species. I mean the same trees, but older. Like they'd been there, longer than trees that size should have been. He shook his head. I know how that sounds. I told him it was fine and thanked him for the information. I wrote it in the notebook that evening. Trees looked older, same species, same size, appeared to have been there longer than physically consistent. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't. But I wrote it down because the notebook was the only place I was being honest. And honesty felt like the only tool I had left. The midpoint of year 9 produced the thing that changed the weight of everything I'd collected. I was at the station on an administrative day cycling through the digital filing system to update my patrol logs when I found a folder I'd never seen before. It wasn't hidden exactly, and it was sitting in the shared drive under a subdirectory labeled NE Sector. Historical documentation. I don't know why I'd never opened it. Possibly because the folder's timestamp showed a creation date of 11 years ago, 1 year before my arrival, and I'd simply never had reason to navigate that far into the archive. Inside were 23 scanned documents. hand-typed reports on old Park Service letterhead, dates ranging from the late 1970s through the early 1990s. Patrol reports, vegetation surveys, one memo from a district supervisor. I read them in order. The patrol reports were ordinary at first, standard language, standard observations. But beginning around 1981, a pattern emerged in the language. Reports from the Northeast sector started including a recurring notation I'd never seen in any other park documentation: auditory baseline absent. It appeared in 6 different reports across 4 years, always associated with the northeast quadrant above the 7,400-foot line. Not a defined term. Not something in the Park Service style guide. Just a phrase that multiple rangers across multiple years had independently reached for when trying to describe what they were encountering. Auditory baseline absent. No birds, no wind signature, no ambient wildlife sound. Corinne's canopy observation documented by people who'd retired before she was hired. The last document in the folder was a memo from 1993. District Supervisor to Station Chief, 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph instructed that Northeast Sector surveys above 7,400 feet be discontinued pending further environmental assessment. The second paragraph said the zone would be designated administratively closed and that all staff should be briefed accordingly. There was a handwritten note in the margin of the second paragraph. Different pen, different hand than the typed text. 7 words. Do not brief on reason. Acknowledge only. I sat at the workstation and read those 7 words until my vision went slightly unfocused. Then I took a photograph of the screen with my personal phone and closed the folder and logged off the system. Do not brief on reason. Acknowledge only. Someone in 1993 made a deliberate decision to tell the rangers that the zone was closed without telling them why. Not because the reason was classified in any formal sense, not because there was a safety protocol requiring silence, but because someone, a district supervisor, an administrator, a person sitting at a desk with a pen, decided that the staff at this station should know the rule and never know the reason. Briggs had been at this park since 1987. He'd been here 6 years before that memo was written. He'd stood in front of that topographic map and given me 40 seconds of instruction in the word nothing. And he'd known the entire time that nothing was not the answer. He'd been told to acknowledge only, and he had. For decades, to every ranger who came through that station, he had acknowledged only. I thought about the way he'd looked at me on my first day. That flat, finished expression. I'd read it as a man who didn't want to be questioned. I understood now that it was something else entirely. A man who had been carrying a specific instruction for years and had learned to perform it so cleanly that even he might have stopped feeling the weight of it. Or maybe he still felt it. Maybe that's what the flatness was. Not indifference, practiced endurance. I drove home with my phone locked in the glove box next to the notebook. I made dinner. I watched an hour of something on television that I couldn't have described 10 minutes after it ended. Then I sat at my kitchen table and thought about Corinne telling me not to go to the boundary. I thought about Diane Ferris and her turned-down quiet. I thought about Paul Garrett and the trees that looked older than they should. I thought about 30 years of rangers curving west on the Northeast Loop, following a bend that felt like their own choice, never asking why the route didn't go straight. The next morning I drove to work. I signed in, I ran my patrol. I curved west at the granite outcropping above Coldwater Creek the same way I always did. My feet made the turn before I thought about it. That's when I understood that the memo hadn't just instructed the station chief, it had instructed all of us, not through a conversation, through a pattern we'd been handed so early and so cleanly that we'd absorbed it as instinct. The zone didn't need a fence. It didn't need a guard. It just needed people like Briggs to say nothing in the right tone of voice to people like me at the right moment. And the distance would maintain itself forever. The question I couldn't answer, the one that kept me awake in a specific and unpleasant way, was whether that distance was protecting us from whatever was in the zone or protecting whatever was in the zone from us. I didn't know which answer scared me more. I went to the boundary. I need to say that plainly because the decision didn't feel plain at all. It took me 3 weeks after finding the memo to commit to it. And during those 3 weeks, I functioned normally. Patrol routes, visitor contacts, shift reports, all of it performed with the mechanical competence of someone who has done a job long enough that his body can run it without his mind being present. My mind was at the ridgeline. Every hour of every day, it was standing at the edge of the tree line looking northeast. I chose a Tuesday in mid-October. Visitor traffic at seasonal low. Clear sky, good light. Temperature in the low 40s. I signed out for a northeast sector patrol, which was true. I followed the standard loop past Coldwater Creek, up the switchback above the boulder field, and at the granite outcropping where the route curves west, I stopped. The curve was right there. I could feel it in my legs. The trained turn, the familiar angle, the path of least resistance worn into my muscle memory over 12 years. My body wanted to go left. Every conditioned instinct I had was already leaning into the turn. I went straight. The terrain climbed gradually through old-growth Douglas fir, the canopy thick enough to cut the sunlight into narrow shafts that moved with the wind. Normal forest. Normal sounds, the Stellar's jay calling somewhere behind me, the dry rustle of something small in the understory, wind pushing through the upper branches in irregular surges. I checked my GPS. The boundary of Zone 9, as marked on the topographic map, was roughly 400 yards ahead. At 300 yards, the jay stopped calling. I kept walking. The understory went still, not gradually. There was a point, a literal line in the terrain that I crossed without seeing it. And behind me the forest was alive, and ahead of me it wasn't. I turned around and looked back. I could still see the last section of trail through the trees, maybe 60 yards behind me. The branches there were swaying. The branches around me were not. Auditory baseline absent. Corinne had described it accurately, but she hadn't conveyed the feel of it. Standing in a forest with no sound is not like standing in a quiet room. A room has walls and you understand the silence as containment. A forest has no walls. The silence shouldn't be possible. Your ears reach for something. Wind, water, insects, anything. And they find nothing. And the nothing has a pressure to it like the air itself is held. I stood still for a full minute. My breathing was the only sound. Not even my boots on the ground had the right resonance. The compression of duff and dry needles should have produced a soft crunch, and what I heard instead was flat and close, as if the sound couldn't travel more than a few inches from its source. I kept going. At 400 yards, I crossed what I estimated to be the boundary. No marker, no sign, no physical indication that I'd passed from one zone to another. It's just the map in my head, the GPS on my belt, and the unbroken stillness of a forest that should have been full of life. The trees were the same species, Same diameter, same height class, same bark texture. But Paul Garrett had been right about something I wouldn't have believed if I hadn't seen it myself. The trees looked older, not bigger, not a different growth stage. They looked like trees that had been standing in place for longer than their size should allow, as if the wood itself carried more time than the rings inside it could account for. I don't know how to describe this in a way that doesn't sound subjective. It wasn't subjective. It was as clear and observable as a change in soil color. The trees on this side of the boundary looked like they had been waiting. I walked another 200 yards into the zone. The clearing was small, maybe 30 feet across. Not a meadow. The ground was bare mineral soil, no grass, no understory growth, no fallen branches. Clean ground in the middle of old-growth forest. The kind of absence that would require either active maintenance or conditions. So hostile to growth that nothing could establish. The soil didn't look disturbed. It looked finished, like it had decided what it was and would not be anything else. In the center of the clearing there was a cairn. I use that word because it's the closest thing I have. A stack of stones, roughly waist high, assembled with obvious intention. Not a trail marker. We were miles from any trail, in a zone that officially received no human traffic. The stones were local granite, angular, unweathered in a way that didn't match the exposure they should have accumulated. No lichen, no moss, no mineral staining from rain contact. In a climate that produces visible weathering on exposed rock within 3 to 5 years, these stones looked like they'd been placed yesterday, or they looked like weathering didn't apply here. I circled the cairn slowly. My boots made almost no sound on the bare soil. On the far side, facing northeast, facing deeper into the zone, there was something else. A small metal box, partially buried at the base of the cairn. Green metal, government standard, the kind of field cache used for emergency supplies or survey equipment. I knelt down and brushed the soil away from its edges. The box was maybe 12 inches long, 8 inches wide, 5 inches deep. A simple clasp, no lock. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a plastic bag that had yellowed but not degraded, were 3 items: a Park Service radio, a field notebook, and a laminated identification card. The ID belonged to a ranger named Thomas Wheel. The photo showed a man in his early 40s with a wind-burned face and the flat, patient eyes of someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors alone. His posting was listed as "This Park." His start date was 1979. There was no end date. I picked up the field notebook. The notebook was the same brand I used, same format, same ruled pages. Thomas Wheel's handwriting was small and precise, the kind of writing that comes from years of field documentation where space matters and clarity is a professional habit. The entries were dated. The first was from September 1982. The last was from April 1983. I'm going to tell you what the relevant entry said, as close to his exact words as I can reconstruct from what I read, kneeling in that clearing with the silence pressing against my ears. September 14th, 1982. Conducted independent survey of any sector above 7,400 feet. Ambient sound drops to 0 at approximately 300 yards past the creek crossing. Effect is consistent and reproducible. No biological explanation. Trees appear normal but register differently. Older than growth patterns indicate. We'll continue observations. October 3rd, 1982. Found the clearing. 30 feet diameter, bare soil, no growth. Soil samples collected. Returned to station. Briggs asked about my route. I told him Zone 8. He didn't press it, but he looked at me in a way that suggests he knows. I think he's been here. November 19, 1982. Third visit to clearing. The cairn was not here on my second visit. I am certain of this. The stones are local granite but show no weathering. Something assembled this between my visits. No tracks, no tool marks, no indication of human presence. My hands were steady, but my breathing wasn't. I turned pages. January 8th, 1983. Sound has changed. On previous visits, the silence was total, pure absence. Today there was something beneath it, not a sound exactly, a frequency. Below hearing but detectable in the chest. Like standing near a transformer but with no source. It seemed to originate from the ground beneath the clearing. February 22nd, 1983. Brought a tape recorder. Ran it for about 40 minutes in the clearing, played it back at the station. The recording is silent for the first 31 minutes. At minute 32, there is a sound I did not hear while recording. It lasts approximately 9 seconds. I have listened to it 14 times. It sounds like breathing, not mine. I was holding my breath at that point in the recording. I remember holding my breath. I turned to the last entry. April 4th, 1983. I understand now what the cairn is for. I don't know how I understand this, but the knowledge arrived fully formed while I was standing in the clearing this morning. The cairn is not a marker. It is an inventory. Each stone corresponds to a visit. I counted the stones today, and there are 7. I have visited the clearing 7 times. Something is counting. The notebook ended there. No final note, no sign-off, no indication of whether Thomas Wheel walked out of the clearing or didn't. Just the clean edge of a last written page, and then blank paper. 40 or 50 unused pages that would never be filled. I put the notebook back in the box. I put the box back at the base of the cairn. Then I stood up and counted the stones. There were 8. I want to tell you that I ran. That would make sense, and it would make this easier to understand, but I didn't run. I stood there looking at the 8th stone sitting on top of the cairn. A piece of angular granite the size of my fist, clean-edged, unweathered, identical to the others, and I felt something I can only describe as recognition. Not fear, not shock. The flat, heavy understanding that a system I had been orbiting for 12 years had just acknowledged my presence. 7 stones for 7 visits. Thomas Wheels, 7 visits. 8 stones now, my first visit. The cairn knew I was here. Or whatever maintained the cairn knew I was here. Or, and this is the thought that made my jaw tighten, the cairn and the knowing were the same thing. I backed away from it, slowly. Not because slow felt safer, but because fast felt like the wrong kind of response, like running from something that has already demonstrated it can count. I retraced my steps through the silent trees. At the boundary, the invisible line where the stillness ended and the forest came back to life, I stopped and listened to the wind resume around me like a held breath, finally released. The Stellar's jay was calling again. The understory rustled with small, ordinary movement. Behind me, the zone sat in its silence and did not follow. It didn't need to follow. It had already added a stone. I drove back to the station. I filed my patrol report. Northeast sector, no incidents, no visitor contact, standard language, standard format. I logged off the terminal and sat in the break room and stared at the wall until Corinne came in for her shift change. She looked at me. "Marcus?" she said. "I went to the boundary," I said. She set her pack down slowly. "Past it," I said. She sat down across from me. She didn't say anything for a long time. I could hear the clock above the door. I could hear the building settling. I could hear all the sounds that a room is supposed to make, and I was grateful for every one of them. "What did you find?" she asked. I told her about the clearing, the cairn, the box, Thomas Wheel's notebook, the 8 stones. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at the table the same way she had when I'd first asked her about Zone 9, measuring something, deciding what fit through the opening. "Thomas Wheel," she said. "He was here before Briggs took over as senior. I've seen his name in old personnel files." She paused. "He's listed as voluntary separation, April 1983, no forwarding address, no exit interview." April 1983, the same month as the last notebook entry. "Corinne," I said, "the cairn added a stone for me. I was there for 20 minutes, and it already knew I'd come." She looked at me with something that was not quite fear and not quite resignation. "It always knows," she said. "That's what Briggs wouldn't say. That's what the memo means. The zone doesn't need us to stay out because it's dangerous." She stopped, corrected herself. "It's not that it isn't dangerous, it's that the danger isn't the point. The point is that it counts. It keeps track. Every person who enters, every visit, every time someone crosses that line, it maintains a record." "A record for what?" Corinne picked up her coffee cup, looked into it, set it back down. "I don't know," she said, "but Thomas Wheel figured it out, and then Thomas Wheel was gone." The clock ticked. The building settled. Outside, the October light was starting to thin toward late afternoon. And somewhere in the northeast corner of the park, in a clearing no one was supposed to visit, there was a cairn with 8 stones. That had been 7 stones that morning. I went home. I locked the notebook in the glove box. I sat in my kitchen and thought about a man named Thomas Wheel, who had visited a clearing 7 times and understood something on the 7th visit that he wrote down in precise, small handwriting, and then disappeared from every record except a personnel file that called it voluntary. I thought about the 8th stone, and I thought about what Corinne had said. It always knows. And I wondered whether the knowing was passive, like a camera recording an empty room, or active, like something that had been waiting for the count to change. I went back. "I need you to understand that I knew it was wrong, not dangerous. I'd moved past the category of dangerous somewhere between the 8th stone and Corinne's quiet confirmation in the break room. Dangerous implies a threat that can be measured against your ability to survive it. This was different. This was a system that had demonstrated awareness of my presence and recorded it with the same dispassionate precision I used to document off-trail hikers. I was a data point now. Going back meant becoming another one. I went back anyway, not because I was brave. Because Thomas Wheel had understood something on his 7th visit, and I needed to know what it was. That need had settled into me like a low-grade fever. Not debilitating, not dramatic, just persistent enough that everything else felt like waiting. 3 days after my first visit, Friday. Overcast sky, temperature dropping toward freezing, the park emptied of visitors by the season and the weather. I signed out for Northeast Patrol. I followed the loop to the granite outcropping. I went straight. The silence found me at the same distance, 300 yards from the boundary, give or take, the same discrete line where the wind stopped and the birds stopped and the forest held still around me like a room that had just noticed someone enter it. I walked through it with my jaw tight and my hands open at my sides. The clearing was the same. Bare soil, no growth. The cairn in the center, the green metal box at its base. I approached slowly and counted the stones from 10 feet away. 9. I stopped walking. 9 stones. My first visit had produced the 8th. I was standing at the edge of the clearing on my second visit, and the 9th stone was already placed. Not while I watched. Not as a response to my arrival. It had been added before I got here, as if my decision to return had been registered at the moment I made it, not the moment I arrived. The stone sat on top of the stack with the same clean-edged, unweathered precision as all the others. Same granite, same angular shape, same impossible freshness. I stood there looking at it and felt the specific kind of vertigo that comes from understanding that a system is operating on information you haven't provided yet. It knew I was coming back before I got here. I walked to the cairn. I knelt at the base and opened the metal box. Wheel's notebook was there. The radio was there. The ID card was there. Everything in the same position I'd left it. I picked up the notebook and opened it to the last entry. April 4th, 1983. Something is counting, and turned to the next page. It wasn't blank. The page after Wheel's final entry now contained writing. Same small, precise handwriting. Same blue ink. But the date was wrong. The date was 3 days ago. The day of my first visit. October 14th. 8th visit. New observer. Male mid-30s, Park Service uniform. Duration approximately 20 minutes. Conducted examination of cache and documents. Departed southwest towards standard patrol route. I read it twice. Then I turned to the next page. October 17th. 9th visit. Same observer. Returned as predicted. Currently reading this entry. The notebook was warm in my hands, not from my grip. I've been holding it for 30 seconds at most. Warm the way paper shouldn't be warm in 40-degree air with no sunlight reaching it. Warm the way something is warm when it's been recently held by someone else. I put the notebook down on the bare soil. I stood up. The silence around me had the quality of attention. Not threatening, not aggressive, but focused in a way that made the air feel denser than it should. Like standing in front of something very large that is looking at you without moving. I walked to the far side of the clearing. The trees at the edge stood in their impossible stillness, and beyond them, the terrain continued northeast into landscape I couldn't see from ground level. I took 3 steps into the tree line on the far side. The ground changed. Not the soil type, not the grade, the age. The same mineral soil, the same granite substrate visible through the thin layer of duff. But it looked older in the way the trees looked older, carrying more time than the physical material should contain. I knelt and touched it with my bare hand. It was warm. The soil was warm. Not surface warmth from solar exposure. The canopy was dense enough to block direct light, and the overcast sky was providing nothing. This warmth came from below, deep and steady and even, like the ground above a heating pipe, except there were no pipes and no infrastructure and no human engineering within miles of where I was kneeling. Something beneath the clearing was generating heat. Something beneath the clearing had been generating heat long enough for the soil to normalize around it, long enough that the warmth didn't feel like an event, but like a condition, a state of being. The ground was warm because the ground had always been warm, because the thing below it had always been there. I pulled my hand back and stood up. My fingertips tingled faintly, not from temperature, but from contact with something my nervous system didn't have a category for. I stepped back into the clearing and looked at the cairn from across the 30-foot diameter of bare, finished soil. Each stone a visit. 9 stones. 9 visits. 7 by Thomas Wheel. 2 by me. The cairn didn't just count entries, it predicted returns. It had known I would come back and had prepared the record before I arrived, which meant it wasn't recording history, it was writing the future. And this was worse. There was no difference between the two from where it stood. I left the clearing. I crossed the silence boundary. I felt the wind come back and heard the birds, and felt the forest resume its ordinary life around me like a curtain falling back into place. I drove to the station. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 11 minutes before I went inside. Corinne was at the front desk. She looked at me when I walked in, and I watched her expression change. Not dramatically, not the way people react in movies, just a small tightening around the eyes. A recognition. "You went back," she said. 9 stones, I said. "It added 1 before you got there." I nodded. She was quiet for a long time. Behind her, the radio crackled, with a routine check-in from Ranger Davis on the South Loop. Normal traffic, normal operations. The park functioning exactly as it was supposed to function. 40,000 acres of managed wilderness running on schedules and protocols and the steady competence of people who had been trained to take care of the land. "There's more writing in the notebook," I said. Wheel's notebook, new entries, in his handwriting, dated this week. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment, just long enough that I understood she was absorbing something she'd been expecting to hear but had hoped she wouldn't. "Marcus," she said, "how many visits did Wheel make before he disappeared?" 7, I said. The notebook documents 7 visits. "And how many stones were there when you first arrived?" 8, 1 for my visit. "And now 9, 2 for you." She opened her eyes and looked directly at me. "What happens at the number the system is counting toward?" I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. But the question rearranged everything I'd been thinking about. I'd been treating the cairn as a passive record, a tally, a ledger, something that documented without acting. Corinne was asking the question I'd been refusing to form. What if the count wasn't documentation? What if it was a timer? Thomas Wheel visited 7 times. After the 7th visit, he understood something. After the 7th visit, he was gone. "I'm not going back," I said. Corinne nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. And then more carefully, "Do you think that matters?" It mattered for 11 days. On the 12th day, I found a stone on my kitchen table, angular granite, clean-edged, unweathered, the size of my fist. Sitting in the center of my kitchen table on the bare wood surface as if it had always been there, as if it were a fixture of the house rather than an object from a cairn in a clearing in a zone that no one was supposed to enter. I hadn't left my door unlocked. I hadn't left my windows open. The house was sealed exactly as I'd left it that morning, and the stone was there anyway. I stood in the doorway of my kitchen and looked at it for what must have been 5 minutes without moving. The granite caught the overhead light and held it in its surface the way wet stone holds light, except it wasn't wet. It was dry and smooth and faintly warm. I didn't touch it. I walked out of the kitchen and sat on the edge of my bed and put my hands over my face and breathed until my heart rate came down from wherever it had gone. The zone didn't need me to come back. The zone was telling me it could come to me. I went back to the kitchen. The stone was still there. I picked it up. It was warm in my hand the same way the soil had been warm. Deep, steady, patient warmth that didn't come from the air or the light. It came from inside. I put it in my glove box next to the notebook. I drove to work. I filed my patrol report. I didn't mention the stone, and I didn't tell Corinne. Not because I was hiding it from her, but because I understood that telling her would make her part of the count, and I was not willing to do that. Whatever system was operating in Zone 9 added stones for visits, and now it was extending its record beyond the zone's boundaries. If it was counting towards something, the count was mine. I wouldn't give it anyone else. 3 more stones over the next week. 1 on the passenger seat of my truck when I came out of the grocery store. 1 on the windowsill of the ranger station break room. I saw it before anyone else and pocketed it while my hands shook. 1 on my pillow when I came home from a 12-hour shift on a Wednesday. Each stone was warm. Each stone was identical to the ones in the cairn. Each stone arrived without evidence of delivery. No footprints, no displaced objects, no indication that anything physical had carried it from the clearing to wherever I found it. I was at 12, 7 for Wheel, 5 for me. On Thursday morning, I drove to the park before dawn. I went to the station. I opened the personnel archive and found Thomas Wheel's file. Corinne was right. Voluntary separation. April 1983. No forwarding address. No exit interview. But there was a detail I hadn't known to look for before. His emergency contact was listed as a sister in Portland. Name, phone number, address. The address was 30 years old, but the name was specific enough to search. I used my phone on my break. I found a death notice for the sister, 2011, natural causes. And in the death notice, a surviving family member, Thomas Wheel's nephew, a man named David Wheel, still living in Portland. I called him that evening from my kitchen table with a warm stone sitting 6 inches from my elbow. He answered on the 3rd ring. I told him I was a ranger at the park where his uncle had worked. I told him I was trying to locate historical personnel records and asked if he had any information about Thomas Wheel's departure from the Park Service. A long pause. My uncle didn't depart, David Wheel said. My uncle went missing in April of 1983. My mother filed a missing persons report. The Park Service told her he'd resigned voluntarily and left no forwarding information. She never believed that. She spent 4 years trying to get them to investigate. Another pause. They never did. I asked him if Thomas had ever mentioned anything about the northeast sector of the park, about a clearing or a cairn, or a zone that was off limits. He mentioned it once, David said. Last time my mother talked to him, he said he'd found something in the park that was keeping track. That's the phrase he used, keeping track. He said he thought it was almost finished counting. I thanked him. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen and looked at the stone on my table and understood with a clarity so total, it felt like something clicking into a locked position, that Thomas Wheel had not resigned. Thomas Wheel had reached the number. Whatever the cairn was counting toward, he had arrived at it, and the arrival was not something you walked away from. The count was at 12, 7, and 5. And I did not know what the final number was. I went to Briggs the next morning. He was in his office, door open, coffee on his desk. The same man who had given me 40 seconds of instruction 12 years ago with a face that said finished. I sat down across from him and put a warm stone on his desk. He looked at it. His face did something I have never seen a human face do. It moved through recognition, grief, and resignation in approximately 2 seconds, and then it was still. "How many?" he said. 12. "Wheel was at 14, he said quietly. 14. And then he was gone. He picked up the stone and held it in his palm and looked at it with the expression of a man holding something he has held before. I told them we needed to tell people. I told them in 83, and I told them again in 93 when they wrote the memo. They said acknowledgement was sufficient. They said if we explained it, more people would go looking, and the count would start for all of them. "What happens at the number, Briggs?" He put the stone down. He looked at me. "I don't know," he said. Wheel thought he knew. He told me the clearing was an inventory system, that it was cataloging something about each person who entered. Not their body, not their name. Something else. Something it needed a specific amount of before it was satisfied. He paused. He said on his 13th visit the ground was warmer. On his 14th it was hot. And then he went back one more time and he didn't come home. 14 for Wheel, 12 for me, 2 more stones, 2 more visits, or 2 more of whatever the zone counted as equivalent, now that it had demonstrated it could bring the stones to me. When I left Briggs's office, I drove home. I collected every stone from my glove box, my windowsill, my kitchen. 5 warm pieces of granite. I drove to the river that runs along the park's southern boundary, and I threw them in, one by one, and watched them sink. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to Zone 9. I haven't received any new stones. Corinne checks in with me every week. A quiet phone call that neither of us pretends is casual. Briggs retired in January. He didn't say goodbye to the staff. He left a note on the break room table that said, "Follow the protocols," and drove away in a truck packed with everything he owned. I'm writing this because I have 2 years left on my contract, and I intend to honor it. I'm writing this because the Northeast Loop still curves west at the granite outcropping, and I still follow the curve every time, and I no longer know if that's training or something else. I'm writing this because 3 weeks ago, a seasonal hire named Jordan Marsh asked me what was in Zone 9, and I looked at him with a flat, finished expression and said nothing. I heard Briggs in my mouth again. But here's what I haven't told anyone, not Corinne, not Briggs, not the administration woman on the phone who asks her 4 questions and waits for the answer she's always waiting for. Last Tuesday, I came home from a double shift. I walked into my kitchen. The table was bare. The house was locked. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Except the kitchen was warm. Not the air, not the walls, the floor. Beneath my feet, through the tile, through the foundation, through the dirt and rock and clay that my house sits on, a warmth that was deep and steady and patient and familiar. The same warmth. I stood there for a long time, then I turned off the light and went to bed, and in the morning the floor was cold again, and I drove to work and ran my patrol and followed the curve and didn't go straight. The count is at 12. I threw the stones in the river. I have not gone back. But I am not certain, but I think that the zone has decided the river doesn't matter. That the stones were a courtesy, not a requirement. That whatever is beneath that clearing has been counting long before cairns and notebooks and rangers, and that it counts in a unit of measurement I don't have a name for, and that it is very, very patient, and that 12 is not 14, but 12 is also not the end. I think the ground beneath my house is getting warmer. I think it's been getting warmer for a while.